Welcome to our sixth Scholars in the Square lecture of the fall season. Hello to those of you who are in the room, especially those we haven't met yet, and those of you who are joining us through Zoom, and also those of you who are joining us in the future through YouTube. Today, after Jingjing Li offers a 20-minute public presentation, there's going to be a 20-minute period in which she will engage in conversation with someone familiar with her research questions. In this case, the interlocutor is Dr. Martin Adam, a professor in our Pacific and Asian Studies department, who gave his own lecture on Buddhist approaches to artificial intelligence just a few weeks ago, so he's a familiar face to many of you. After Jingjing and Martin talk for about 20 minutes, I'll engage them and the rest of the community in an open discussion period. That'll last also about 20 minutes. Our speaker today is Dr. Jingjing Li, a university lecturer at the Institute for Philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. There, she specializes in Chinese and comparative philosophy. In particular, she examines the theories of mind in ancient Chinese Buddhist sources, but always with an interest in the way these ideas develop over time and within the broader Buddhist world. Jingjing is a visiting fellow with the CSRS this term. I believe this is her third visit with us, and when you get to know her a little bit today, you'll see why we always welcome her return. The practical application of Jingjing's analysis reflects a broad wish at the center to ensure that our work is connected to the political realities in which we all live. And so before I begin, I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples, whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jingjing.
So thank you, Paul, for the nice introduction. I'm very grateful to Paul and Rachel for having me again as a CSRS fellow, and to Scott and Narco for organizing this event. And my thanks must go to Martin for agreeing to be the interlocutor, and also to all of you here in the room and on the Zoom. So today's theme is emotion and feminism in the Buddhist philosophy of consciousness only, which is integral to my current research project on Buddhist feminism. To start with, I actually want to ask our group here, right? So what have you learned about emotions in Buddhism? Or have you learned about emotions in Buddhism? Any preliminary thoughts, like any ideas or any things going on in your mind when you saw the title of the talk? Yes.
It's kind of different in different traditions, different understandings of emotion and the value of emotion in different traditions of Buddhism.
Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. My own experience has been in Western Zen community, where I would say emotion is valued and expressed quite a bit. I think that's probably Western cultural influence. I've also spent time in Theravadan Buddhist community, where it's much less encouraged. And so I just noticed between those two, in my limited experience, very different attitudes towards emotion within traditions.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Oh, sorry. We probably only have time for one, but please, because you have your hand on first.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind for me is the three lakshanas. First and foremost, the greed, hatred, and delusion that we don't hear about so much in Buddhism. And in the positive sense, positive emotion being the absence of greed, hatred, and delusion.
Very good. So indeed, cultivating our emotion is a crucial part of Buddhist training, right? And how so? This is a very brief overview. So we all know that the founder of this tradition, the Buddha, has taught about how life is full of suffering. And the root of suffering is our ignorant views and attachment to the self. So to end the suffering, practitioners need to go through an overall transformation of their views and perspectives to extirpate attachment. In this sense, this transformative process, right, from ignorance to awakening or to enlightenment, is not just about to change our way of knowing. It is also about regulating our emotions and feelings. So cultivating our affective life, such as developing the attitude of not harming or restraining one's anger and hatred, becomes crucial for the Buddhist practice. Nevertheless, the more I delve into the Buddhist approach to emotion, the more I wonder if emotions are just inner psychological states. This is particularly the case because of the Bodhisattva ideal. So who are the Bodhisattvas? They are advanced practitioners who have realized the empty nature of the self to embrace interconnectedness. That is to say, there is no self because nothing can truly stand on its own and all by itself. Take this house, for instance, right? It is made of concrete and steel by construction workers and architects commissioned by the university used by us for educational purposes. But what if there would be a lack of building materials? What if the university wouldn't want to make the budget? What if all of us, right, as students and educators, we would just refuse to come here? Every single factor is mentioned above, right? Without them, no matter how big or how small they are, this building wouldn't come into existence as it is. That is to say, this building doesn't have any essential core. It appears because of all of those interconnected causes and conditions. So once practitioners arrive at this realization, they will see the interdependence between all sentient beings as well. That is why the Bodhisattvas, right, those advanced practitioners, they actually choose to postpone their own awakening to return to the world of suffering to help others and guide them on the right path. This is where we actually see a clear call for Buddhists to be more socially engaged. And the Bodhisattva ideal soon complicates the picture we saw earlier, specifically because in this world reality, right, the effective life of those Bodhisattvas is not just about what they will go through psychologically at a personal level. Embracing interconnectedness, they also navigate an effective life that is always open to others, always interpersonal. But the question is, how shall we address this interpersonal aspect of emotion in Buddhism? To answer this question, I would propose turning to a story in the Vimalakirti Sutra. So here we have a stele commissioned by a group of very pious Buddhists in northern China during the mid-500 CE. So in the upper half of the stele, the main narrative of the Vimalakirti Sutra has been inscribed. So let's zoom in. On the right side, we have Vimalakirti sitting under a canopy. Vimalakirti is the main protagonist. That is why the text is named after him. He is depicted as a lay follower, right? He is not a monastic. He is not an ordained monk. He is a merchant who likes to walk around in his city and talk to his fellow citizens about emptiness. But one day, Vimalakirti became quite ill, and he was wondering why the Buddha didn't send anyone to visit him. And then, hearing his wish, the Buddha sent his disciples and a group of bodhisattvas to Vimalakirti's house. One of the bodhisattvas is Manjushri here on our left, known for the wisdom of emptiness. Knowing about the arrival of this delegation, Vimalakirti exercised his magical power to empty his house, removing all the fancy decors, interior design, the furniture, the servants. And then upon arrival, Manjushri asked the Vimalakirti about his condition. And the Vimalakirti said, I am ill because all sentient beings are ill. The sickness of bodhisattvas arises from their compassion for sentient beings. And then they start the conversation on how bodhisattvas need to cultivate their compassionate practice in light of the wisdom of emptiness in order to cure their sickness. But then at that time, right, one of the Buddha's disciple, a monk, Shariputra, he is portrayed here in the center, standing right next to the tree. A thought emerged in Shariputra. He said, how come the house is so empty? Where would all the bodhisattvas and the disciples sit? He didn't say that out loud, but somehow Vimalakirti heard him. And then Vimalakirti turned to Shariputra and said, why do you come here? Do you come here for the seed? Or do you come here for the teaching? And then Vimalakirti exercised his magic again, and suddenly in his empty abode, the entire cosmos manifests. And then Manjushri turned to Vimalakirti and the lay practitioner and the bodhisattva, right? They started another conversation on how all bodhisattvas should perceive sentient beings as illusions. And our story, sorry for this, our story starts when their conversation comes to an end. Because all of a sudden, a Devi appears. Joyfully, she approaches Shariputra. The Devi is also sometimes translated as the goddess. So we have her here on the other side of the tree in the center, facing Shaliputra. But by now, we more or less have a sense of what kind of mindset Shaliputra, this monk, has, right? Now, let's go to another painting where the Devi and the Shaliputra, they are foregrounded. So, to draw his attention, the Devi starts scattering flowers, right? So in the painting, we can kind of see the Devi holding flower petals in her left hand. These petals don't stick to Bodhisattva's clothing, but they just cannot be removed by Shaliputra. While Shaliputra is so puzzled by those unmovable flowers, just as how he was so confused by Vimalakirti's empty house. The Devi seizes the chance to ask Shaliputra why he is so persistent in removing the flowers. And Shaliputra lays down a standard answer that flowers are against monastic disciplines. To expose Shaliputra's tendency of misperceiving things, the house, the flowers, and monastic disciplines as some sort of unchanging entity with essence, the Devi urges Shaliputra to think further. For Shaliputra, things do have essence, but the Devi disagrees. Eventually, Shaliputra launches his final move and questions why the Devi, who is supposed to be so smart, remains in her female body. Because Shaliputra has learned to deem the female body as essentially impure as the trigger of desire. At the climax of the story, the Devi turns Shaliputra into herself and changes her bodily appearance into that of Shaliputra. Just like Vimalakirti, the Devi is a talented magician. She relays the same question right back to Shaliputra. Why does the female body remain? This is when Shaliputra couldn't open an answer. Later on, Vimalakirti comes back to the stage to reveal the identity of the Devi as a high-level bodhisattva. This story in the Vimalakirti Sutra has been favored by East Asians and features several types of artwork. On the surface, it is, of course, about emptiness. However, this exchange is also a richly effective moment for both the Devi and Shaliputra. In the text, the Devi appears with joy. And from the two portraits we have here, there is actually a very similar layout. The Devi opens her arms with confidence as a gesture of welcoming ideas. In contrast, Shaliputra is leaning backward, holding his arms, trying to look away. It is quite an unsettling moment for Shaliputra because from his perspective, the Devi just keeps breaking socially accepted norms on how to behave appropriately in the talk and how to please the monastic majority. Do notice that there are also interesting parallels and striking discrepancies between how Shaliputra communicates with Vimalakirti and how he interacts with the Devi. Right? Nevertheless, the Devi is not discouraged at all. The salient feature of her appearance is joy. So how shall we make sense of this affective moment, which is at the interpersonal level? To do so, I turn to the school of consciousness only, that it compares our experience to a scroll of a painting. There are two interlaced forces that work together to compose the painting and thus constitute our experience. The first force is consciousness. It is the cognitive force that configures the structure of our experience. Metaphorically, consciousness provides the outline of the sketch. The other force is called mental factors, like emotions, feelings, affects, that fill the sketch with colors and textures to make the painting tangible. So while consciousness configures the structure of our experience, mental factors like emotions and affects continue to cohere it. This framework provides us with a way of explaining how various objects arrive concretely and coherently in our experience. Take the house, for instance. When we think about a house, we do not just have an abstract notion, isn't it? It is where our home is, where we meet up and help friends, where we feel safe and warm. But we feel this way about the house. Is it because the house is just inherently warm and safe? Probably not. Our emotion is not triggered so easily by a thing out there. Emotion is always contextualized in our overall mindset, structured by the cognitive force of consciousness, and it continues to cohere this mindset where various things appears vividly. So the house is never just a building out there, right? After being conditioned generation after generation in modern times, every one of us knows that my house is my property. In this egocentric mindset, I become so effectively attached to the house. I'm happy when the house is renovated so I can proudly host more get-together. I get worried when the house is under attack. These emotions are interesting because we can actually go through them even when we don't actually have a house. Think about the people who are hunting for properties, right? They're on the market. They can stigmatize certain neighborhoods because they would be worried about the safety in those neighborhoods. But they don't actually have a house yet. They're still hunting for a house, but still they can go through those emotions. This is where the politics of emotions transpires. Emotion is not just the inner psychological state. It is also that which coheres various types of relationship in our shared experience, and those relationships are always political. This socio-political dimension of emotion has been unpacked by feminist philosophers, Sarah Ahmed, for instance. In her book, The Promise of Happiness, she reveals that when we start to internalize the egocentric view of happiness as the end of life, we also turn happiness into a discourse to mobilize resources in the public and private sectors. For instance, the booming posture yoga business is part that Paul and Rachel are working on. It is part of this happiness industry. But in the meantime, this industry can also act to marginalize and exclude the unhappy others in our society, because we tend to blame the unhappy others, right? The angry woman, the feminist killjoys, right? For instance, for not trying hard enough to make their own life flourish. And it is not just joy or happiness. Ahmed has also written on the cultural politics of many other emotions to show how, for instance, fear can be mobilized by political powers as the discourse of phobia against specific communities. My fear that my house is under threat actually comes with politics, because my fear coheres my way of getting attached to what is mine, to the point that I am actually willing to stigmatize others to protect what is mine. Speaking of the house, right? This is not how Vimalakirti feels about his house, isn't it? As a matter of fact, he intentionally empties his house. But miraculously, this is how the empty house becomes the ideal venue for the Bodhisattvas to teach others. Just because the house is empty, it comes with all the possibilities. Remember, the entire cosmos can manifest in it. Then what would an effective life be if emotion is not contextualized in an egocentric mindset? Yeah. So this is where the contrast between the Divi and Shaliputra needs to be foregrounded again. For Shaliputra, his emotion is indeed contextualized in this mindset of ignorance, right? But it must be noted that he doesn't come to this way of living all by himself. It is after years and years of conditioning throughout communal history that the Shaliputra internalizes this predominant mindset as his habit. So social conditioning pronounces a shared ignorance that cuts across generations. Embracing this mindset, Shaliputra is very used to reducing things to essences like the house, monastic rules, gender identity, and the very body. Further cohering this mindset, his joy arises when his desires and expectations are fulfilled. He feels confused when lay practitioners don't act in accordance with monastic standard, and he becomes unpleasant when norms are broken. In contrast, the Divi's emotion is contextualized in a different mindset because she perceives things as illusion. So she embraces emptiness. But do notice that she is not a nihilist either. She affirms the illusory nature of phenomenon, not to consolidate ignorance, but to criticize ignorance. And this critical use of illusion is very crucial for an interpersonal exchange, because it gives the Divi a way to communicate with Shaliputra and counter his worldview. Joyfully, she welcomes those encounters as golden opportunity to teach so she can counter suffering. But when she is teaching, she continues to cultivate her joy as her altruistic lifestyle. In this way, she shows Shaliputra a different way of living, like opening a window in the world of Shaliputra to shed light on the different possibility of enjoying life. She doesn't reproduce the same type of joy Shaliputra has. Quite to the contrary, her joy is intersubjectively oriented, practically resilient, and interdependently emancipatory. In this process, right, Shaliputra probably also knows that the female body, just like the house, exists only in his world of ignorance. And this comprehension can make Shaliputra reflect on his ignorance and then aspire to change himself. So an interpersonal exchange can bring over the potential of animating a communal change. Then we can ask this question. If emotion is always contextualized in the shared mindset, can we change the promise of emotion? Joy, for instance, can be mobilized by the happiness industry to exclude unhappy others. But can we change the promise of joy? In the framework presented by the consciousness-only school, we can indeed envision this possibility. The story of this happy Devi shows that we can work together to recontextualize joy for inclusion and emancipation. This joyful Devi serves as an inspiration for navigating a feminist life by embodying a killjoy as a way of criticizing ignorance and developing resilience. She also reminds us to constantly reflect upon our unquestioned presumptions to promote non-dominance. And this is where the Bodhisattva's path and the feminist path can converge through acknowledging the critical and the transformative power of emotion. Thank you.
Now we do part 2, where Martin and Jingjing will have a chat.
Great. Well, thank you, Jingjing. Am I lined up correctly for the cameras? I hope so. So this was fascinating and very timely. I think it's always interesting to see how different philosophical orientations intersect. And you alluded at the very end to feminism, which you didn't talk as much about as the Buddhism part. So maybe we could begin by just talking a little bit about where you see that intersection and expanding on your final point where you talk about emancipation, and then we can see how the two, share and support each other.
Am I supposed to answer now?
Yeah, we can just have a conversation about it. I mean, it's not, it's just more like, let's open up that part of the discussion a bit. So we talk about feminism, and then we can maybe draw it back towards Buddhism and the interesting, developments with the Devi and the Arahat, Sariputra, and all their interactions, which are so fascinating.
So first, I should say that Martin has already pinpointed that the Shaliputra is one of the Buddha's disciples, and it is very common. I have to make this disclaimer here. It is very common to read the story between the Devi and the Shaliputra as some sort of victory of Mahayana against Theravada, right? I think that's one way of reading the story, but I don't think we have to go there. I don't think we have to associate the Devi or Shaliputra with specific Buddhist schools. So that has to do with the first layer of my answer to the feminist connection here, which has to do with methodology. Colleagues in Buddhist studies like Amy Langenberg, they argue for the importance of the method which is known as feminist hermeneutics, which means that it is a specific way of engaging with the text so that we can rediscover previously overlooked voices of a woman, previous writing of a woman, and the previous themes related to feminism. In doing so, what is important is what Catherine McKinnon has referred to as raising consciousness, right? So in a sense that we used to read the text in a certain way, but how the text has usually been read probably represents just one voice, even though that voice has been predominant, right? I think there are also very interesting dynamics going on, because isn't the case that the Shaliputra also, he is very accustomed to understanding things in a certain way, even though that way probably at a certain point was predominant, right, in the community. But apparently what used to be predominant, we use the term used to, right, means that those readings can be changed. Those voices can be balanced.
Right.
But how do we do it? I think this is where the feminist insight shows up, right? First and foremost, in the sense that we engage with the text to notice those voices and those crucial moments. I think that's one. Aside from the method regarding the content, I think the feminist insight also has to do with the ways in which emotions, they are not just psychological. I have to say that the psychological aspect of emotion is very important, but the socio-political aspect is important as well. But how do we do that? Sarah Ahmed said, in order to think about this, we need to not just ask what emotion is, but what emotions can do, right? What it can do in our society. And if we're going down this road, very quickly we start to see how emotion reveals different kind of entangled power relationship. I used gender/sex as one way of revealing those dynamics, but there are also others. I alluded to them from time to time, right? For instance, how about the hierarchy between monastics and lay practitioners, right? How shall we address that? This is interesting when we start to think about how Shariputra interact with Vimalakirti. He never asked Vimalakirti, hey, why are you a lay Buddhist? Why are you not a Dent? But he asked the Devi, right? Why are you still in your female body? Isn't that interesting that he was interacting with the interlocutors differently, right?
Yeah,
but it's the same Shariputra.
Yeah, you raise a number of really interesting points. I don't know which one to pick up on now. Perhaps this one question I have, I want to come back to what you said about the psychological states as well as the interpersonal, because that's very important, as you said, that in point of fact, that, this began as a kind of, early Buddhism had this whole taxonomy of the psychological states and emotional states were cataloged there. But we'll come back to that in a moment. I want to ask you, just continuing a little bit on the feminist thread, and I want to ask you maybe about the context of the origins of this Mahayana Sutra, because it seems to me as some of the themes that are being brought out, actually, they almost sound like they're, premonition of feminism. I mean, the very fact that you have this Devi who is coming out and she does a shape-shifting things, or she transfers into the body of Sariputra at one point and they trade places, and it's almost like there's an early recognition of the of the relativity of these ideas and the non-essential nature of what we would call gender, and I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, just in terms of how this was anticipated and what might have been going on when this text was actually composed.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think at the background, I am always mindful of the critique of the work philosophers are doing, in a sense that, are we going too far, right? Are we reading the text beyond how the text was understood back in the days, right? So if we're reading the text in such an innovative manner, are we reading or misreading? So I think it's also it's very important to contextualize the text, as you mentioned. So for a long time, this text, the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, it is usually being read as a text about non-duality. I didn't actually use this term. So basically, it has to do about how to understand things don't happen, things are empty, and things don't have some sort of essential core, right? But this is where we start to see how this idea becomes illustrated and exemplified throughout the text, right? So I wouldn't say that it's some sort of proto-feminism.
Okay.
I would say that it's in this overarching understanding of things having no essential core. The text actually showcases different kind of phenomenon to epitomize what it means. So it has to do with the hierarchy between laity and monasticism. It has to do with just the house out there. It has to do with Vimalakirti's identity, the Devi's identity, and then of course the Shariputra's understanding. this is actually how the story has been read already by forerunners of Buddhist feminism, like Rita Gross. Right?
Sure.
But I didn't mention this because I try not to get too much into the sort of scholastic theory of Buddhist philosophy. But for the consciousness only school, we also have a commentary on this sutra. And very interestingly, their commentary specifically highlights that this text is about the Bodhisattva's practice. There is a very interesting twist here, right? If this text is being read as a text about emptiness, and then our focus should be on how to understand things are empty, right? But if the text is being read as a text for Bodhisattva's practice, and the focus has been shifted to how to interact with illusion. That's what the Bodhisattvas are doing, right? And I find that really interesting, how to interact with illusion. This is a very demanding task because it says, basically the requirement is that we cannot explain illusion away. We cannot say that gender is illusory, so it doesn't matter. Laity is illusory, it doesn't matter. It does matter because that's what Bodhisattvas need to interact with. So how do they do it? This is where I see the convergence of those two paths.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's great. A good answer for that. It brings me back to thinking about a very fundamental question, maybe in terms of these categories. We have the categories of monk, laity, man, woman, and we also talk about emotions. So we have these, these sort of basic categories we're talking about. And I wondered if you might say a word about how the consciousness only school understood the basic nature of these words that we're talking about, qua empty, because if we go back earlier, when you go into the Abhidharma ontology, the early Buddhism, my understanding is that masculinity and femininity were actually considered to be, like qualities of the mind, dhammas, that were part of the taxonomy of the things you can find in the mind. And then maybe later on, there was this evolution of the understanding of what is masculinity, femininity, qua empty, and that was brought into the picture. Similarly, other things like the word emotion, is there an actual category, emotion? Or is it that you've got diverse phenomena that we now use the category, our present day category, emotion, and sort of group them under that? So maybe we could just talk about the categories in terms of which we're thinking and where they originate. Are they in the actual tradition, or are they something that we're bringing to bear?
Thank you for this question. I think there are also two levels in this question. The first is, again, methodology, and the second is the actual the conceptual content here, right? I don't know if we have noticed that I didn't actually choose the standard scholastic treatises. I selected a sutra with a lot of stories. I think now there are colleagues who are arguing for the importance of narratives. For instance, Adina McNichol, she has just published a book on Prita, and she also focused on narratives, stories. I think the importance and value of stories, the narratives, have actually been overlooked by people like us who work on doctrines, right? Because when we start to read the stories, we start to see all the nuances, the nice things, right? So it's never just about one category. It's a story, it has a narrative, it has plots, it has emotions. Part of the reason I like those images is like, we look at their body language, we look at their faces. It's never just, it's never just this serene. I think this is probably the standard image of Buddhism when we start to think about Buddhism, peace and love, serene. But in history, it's actually something like this, right? And the Devi is dressed in Chinese history. This is actually the dress of a girl servant. So it's she doesn't, and then Manjushri is being portrayed as a bodhisattva. You look at their attires, you see the contrast, but it actually shows how people understand those stories, right? And then Shariputra, I need to think more about it, but Shariputra's image is a standard image of a monk, right? but the face is not the face of an East Asian. So there are other interesting dynamics. Because of time, I cannot dive deeper into it. But I think this is where those narratives, they give us the concrete flesh of categories. So regarding the content, I have to confess that I have done a lot of work on those doctrinal ideas. And then if we have to trace the categories regarding gender/sex, I think that has to do with the body, right?
Yeah.
So in early Buddhist texts, one of the colleagues, Cherise Nassarin, she has written this wonderful dissertation to discuss the indriya. So basically, indriya is translated as the sense faculties. The body is indriya in the Shravakayana tradition. So it's the Abhidharma tradition. So basically, it's not part of the Mahayana tradition, but it also develops very scholastic, very systematic theories of reality. So in his dissertation, Cherise has analyzed how the category of body indriya has changed. So associated with the body indriya, we start to have the male indriya and the female indriya. But when we move on to the Mahayana context, the understanding of the body has changed again. For instance, in this consciousness-only school, it is said that our body, right, this sense faculty, is also constituted by consciousness. What does that mean, right? I think that's where we can start to explore more and more possibilities. And regarding emotions, this is also the work the colleague Maria Heim has written a lot. There is a specific term in Sanskrit and Pali, it's called vedana. It is usually translated as a feeling, and there are different ways of classifying vedana. So I think Maria Heim has written a lot of work on it, very important. For instance, joy and suffering and equanimity, they are all vedanas, they are feelings. But it's not just the vedana. How about anger? Is anger an emotion? Of course. And then how about exhaustion, tiredness, but also effort, right? Patience, forbearance, they are also emotions. So that's why I didn't specifically go to one term, but generally those mental states, they are being grouped under this umbrella term of mental factor. In Pali, it is known more often as chitta-citta, and then in Sanskrit it's chaita.
Yeah, so this is really interesting because the examples you give, and just to bring you back to one of the main themes that you have in your talk, some of these emotions that you're referring to are clearly interpersonally, you can't understand them unless you talk about relationships, right? And others, like the picture of the Buddha with the tranquil face, he's undergoing or the Bodhisattva, I don't know exactly who we're looking at there, but some state of serenity and calm, which we can characterize as having an effective content, right? And that's a private thing, right? There's no interaction going on with other people at that time. So I think in your talk, you said that, it's very important to remember that we are talking about psychological states, but in some cases, these have to be understood. They don't make sense unless you understand them interpersonally. But it's also really important to note that emotions also have a private component to them, right? And that, some very important emotions like the recognition of one's own impending death, for example, and the terror you feel at that is an incredible motivator. And I think a lot of people, to go back to one of your main points in this talk, a lot of people underestimate the importance of emotion to the Buddhist path. Right? They think of it as being somehow, rational, or all these preconceptions that it's, observation based, and you just have to do a number of meditative exercises and so on. But actually, emotion is critical, and certain emotions are actually cultivated, right? And you've had the example of compassion of the goddess, right? Is very, very important. That caring, right? And paradoxical in the Mahayana context, because that care is directed towards ultimately non-existent beings, right? Yeah, so.
I very much agree.
Just one, that's one last answer, and then we'll turn it to the group. So can't wait to hear this answer.
I very much agree. This is also the question I have been discussing a lot with my colleague Stephen Harris. He actually works on the cultivation of emotion on the Bodhisattva's path. I think I also mentioned that for the Devi, right? There is a very crucial but often overlooked aspect of her joy, which is about her resilience. I think that part does show the more personal side, but the personal side is always interlinked with the interpersonal side, right? So that's why I think I mentioned earlier that I think the psychological aspect is crucial, but I would see more discussion about how the psychological aspect and the socio-political aspect of the emotion, how they interlace.
Okay.
Wonderful. Maybe we'll pick up some of these themes, I think, in the broader conversation. So thanks very much, Martin. And stick around, please, obviously. So and now some time we have for conversation with the group. That's the first question. Those of us who are at the center, we're center fellows, are likely to meet with Jingjing tomorrow morning, if the jet lag allows. Jingjing just got off the plane like 20 minutes ago, I guess last night, but she's been extremely solid in your presentation, given how little sleep you've had. So, questions? Catherine.
I don't know if I'll make it tomorrow morning. I'm also jet lagged from a long trip. So I want to get back to the Devi. Why did the Vimalakirti decide to use a feminine figure? Was it because he wanted to use shock by doing the unheard thing of a female, in the sense as the person of wisdom and experience, and therefore the ultimate guide? And it was the shock value he was after to reverse things. Or was it because the Devi was very prominent in his Indian context, which then, of course, as his thought traveled, could have been gathered more steam in Tibet, and then perhaps in certain Chinese circles too. So that's my question. Why the Devi? Is it shock or context, put it simply?
Thank you for this question. I have also entertained the appearance of the Devi a lot. So I think there are several possibilities. The first possibility is that it can be understood as some sort of collaboration between Vimalakirti and the Devi, right? If we're going down that road, and then does it mean that there is actually a Bodhisattva community? And then they kind of share work with one another, given the timing, right? Historically, there are some scholars who work on the consciousness-only school who are advocating for building a Bodhisattva community. For instance, one of my colleagues, Jessica Zhu, she has written on one of those scholars about the Bodhisattva community, and her book is coming out, I think, soon, next March. So that's one possibility. Another possibility I have entertained probably has to do with the literary style of texts like this, right? Because in the Vimalakirti Sutra, there are moments, interesting moments that kind of showcase the entire structure of the story. For instance, earlier we learned that the overarching narrative has to do with how Vimalakirti one day he become very sick, and then the Bodhisattvas and the Buddha's disciples came to visit him, right? And then, of course, what the sickness is a metaphor, what it is, how to understand that. But very interestingly, before the visit, I have omitted a lot of details. So when the Buddha kind of learned that Vimalakirti became sick, he actually asked around and see who wanted to visit Vimalakirti. he first asked his disciples, and all of his disciples are like, oh no, I can't do it. Why? Because in the past I had this encounter with Vimalakirti, and he completely beat me, right, with his magnificent wisdom. Towards the end of this round of asking, one of the Buddha's disciples said, oh, I'm not qualified to visit Vimalakirti. Why? Because one day, Buddha, you are sick, right? And then I went to get milk from the mendicants. And then Vimalakirti appeared and said, you are making a mistake. The Buddha is so powerful. How can the Buddha be sick? Don't humiliate us by asking milk around in the city. How can the Buddha be sick? And then the monk was kind of like, oh my God. And then all of a sudden the Buddha appeared miraculously in the sky and then kind of explained why the Buddha can be sick, right? Think about those literary styles, right? So another way of explaining the appearance of the deity is also that this moment also mirrors the entire overarching narrative of the text. That's another way of interpreting it. But the more I think about this, the more I start to wonder whether we are asking the wrong question. If we are really going down this road, we're actually taking the deity as a real person, Vimalakirti as a real person, right? Those are all the funs of reading sutras like this, right? But should they be taken as a real person? Isn't it the case that the entire idea is that Bodhisattvas should approach phenomenon as illusions, right? So maybe our confusions are exactly what is expected, right? Our confusions kind of reveal our way of understanding those figures, but maybe those ways are wrong. And in this way, the text also comes with this critical function of how readers tend to read them, right? I think those are the thoughts I had. Thank you.
Viviane?
I mean, amazing presentation as always, because I was there last year for your coffee talk. So, I mean, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I felt like the Devi was being a feminist killjoy, sort of. That's the imagery. I thought because, he's initially, Sariputra is disappointed. He's angry that, why aren't you discarding your female body? Because earlier he's shocked that, she's so impure. And sorry for the long question. I'm just kind of articulating it. And Sarah Ahmed is talking about how, when she starts her own story in Living the Feminist Life, she's talking about how she's a feminist killjoy, her own aunt is a feminist killjoy. And when the party gathering happens, these women who are expressing their emotions of anger, resentment, they are feminist killjoys in South Asian context. So I want to understand, how do the contemporary practitioners of Buddhism, how do they, when they are becoming killjoys, how do they comply with Buddhism while expressing their own emotions, which could be conceived a misfit with the dominant societal perception of how a woman should behave like?
Thank you for the question and the comment. I also have to mention that it is not, please do know, it's not always the case that whenever female bodhisattvas or bodhisattva in female appearance, right? It's definitely not the case that whenever they appear, they are always killjoys. Sometimes they are also very compassionate and very hospitable. For instance, another Buddhist text, the Srimala Devi Sutra, right? The text is also named after the protagonist, Lady Srimala. So in that text, Srimala was, she was always waiting for the chance to find a way to become the teacher of people in her city. But she always couldn't find the chance. So she has always been waiting for the right timing until one day she received a letter from her parents. And then here we start to see the miracles, right? And the Buddha manifests in the sky in a celestial way. And then the Buddha had a conversation with Srimala, but we didn't get a lot of the Buddha's account. We have mostly Srimala's account. And then what Shrimala has taught. This is what Diana Paul has written. Sorry, I have all the sources. Has written now. So this is a text where a human lady can be a teacher in the Buddhist tradition. And then what she has taught is this very idea we're all familiar with, that all sentient beings, even though we're different, all of us, we can realize our Buddhahood and become awake. And then she actually, after the exchange with the Buddha, she made her vows, and then she explained this idea of, which is in Buddhism known as Tathagata Garbha, but it just means that all sentient beings have the potential to become awake. And then she went ahead to her city to teach the citizens about this. So in that context, right, Lady Shramana definitely is not a killjoy. The presentation, the portrayal of female figures, or if we want to be more precise, Bodhisattvas who appear as women, right? That portrayal is also full of diversity. But regarding the cultural influence of the Shrimala Sutra, I think the DV has this empowering effect to the point that, for instance, one of the Buddhist nuns I'm working on right now, she, in the interview, the writer asked her, right, have you always been so bold, right? Why you cannot tolerate wrong views from others? And then now she just said, tolerance has a limit. When the view is wrong, I feel obliged to say it out loud, right? And this Buddhist nun, she actually hold a very high rank position in mainland China in the 1980s. But she is known for being this sharp and non-tolerant, right? I think it is specifically because of those precedents in the text, or probably those role models, that the norms inside the Buddhist tradition, this is something I haven't fully thought through yet. The norms are not being interrupted, right? So it's a very different idea from liberal feminism in a sense that resistance is the only way, and then we have to break away with the tradition. Another colleague has written a lot about this, but it's more in the Islamic context. Muhammad Bilgi, he talks about this anti-teleological feminism. But in the Buddhist context, because of the existence of the non-community, we also see that norms are, of course, being continued. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those norms remain unchanged. Those moments, right, in the text, when those moments start to be read and reread and reread and reread, we start to see how women in the tradition, they start to explore their agency so that they renew the tradition while continuing it. I think this is also a very crucial aspect of history.
Thank you. Shema?
So I'm trying to articulate this question. I found your metaphor of the construction of this building and sort of the interconnectedness of it very compelling. And I'm wondering the role of the society that commissioned the stela in this relationship to all this, and particularly to kind of that central part of the Devi's role as a kind of a feminist killjoy and how they would kind of connect to that.
We don't know a lot about the donors who commissioned this stele. So this stele is currently being preserved at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but all of those images now they're in the open domain. So according to the introduction of Met, what we know is just that this lay Buddhist community, it is a lay community. And at a certain point in history, it became quite popular. So the donors, they were also inscribed right underneath. You can actually see them. And the leader of the community, his name was also inscribed on the stele. So that's the information we have from material culture. So I don't know how we can probe further into it without more evidence in material culture.
I would suggest then treating them as a character in the layers of the story, not necessarily probing outside of the story, but sort of just like everybody else is present as kind of semi-historical, semi-illusionary. They are also part of kind of one layer of the interlocutors with all of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. Yes. If I can just add a follow-up on it, historically, that's a time period. It was the time when the Chinese continent was divided to the north and the south, and then different dynasties ruled the northern part, and different dynasties ruled the southern part. But specifically in the northern part, Buddhism became very prominent, and then women definitely championed this trend. Stephanie Balkwell, she has studied the history a lot of the northern dynasties. But I think I haven't encountered any specific discussion about women communities commissioning artwork related to the Vimalakirti Sutra. But I think your suggestion is very interesting, and I would like to explore further.
Thanks. There's a question from Zoom.
Yes, so friend of the center, Adela Torsha, asks, first comments, thanks so much, Jingjing. It's very enlightening to hear about this aspect of socially engaged Buddhism. It's a great relief to know that our emotions can be vehicles for enlightenment, rather than always being obstacles to detachment. I'm wondering how open or welcome traditional Buddhist scholarship has been to the idea of Bodhisattvas who use emotion to promote inclusion and emancipation, to advance a new version of Buddhist feminism. Is there a reasonable amount of openness to this idea?
Thanks, Adela.
Thank you very much for this question. I think the brief answer is yes. For instance, in early Republican China, when the Bhikkhuni community was restored, they also started to publish their writings, and they also ran their journal. Unfortunately, the journal was short-lived, but we do have reprint of those journals. And then the story of the Divi and Vimalakirti actually featured in the first volume of the journal. It was a rewrite of this story and then published in the journal. So I would say yes. And then contemporarily in the Chinese-speaking regions, I think Buddhist monks are also very mindful of the importance of emotion and how emotions can also be used for promoting non-dominance and inclusion.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Jingjing and Martin. That was wonderful.